So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be back at JLF, and Raghu, this audience is thanks to you. So, I read Breaking the Mold with great interest, and there are many points of agreement, complete agreement. I made a list, a partial list. The need for India to grow faster than the 7% or so that we're currently averaging. The importance of jobs in growth. The importance of services in growth. The importance of innovation to what we need to achieve as a country. The importance of good governance in how we enable our institutions to perform. The importance of education and human capital in our future, and indeed on a much more open trading stance where we see the world as our market to engage with. There are a couple of points of concern more than disagreement. A sort of message that I got that you prefer services over manufacturing, which we will come to very soon. And a message also of preferring more radical research-based and fundamental innovation to incremental innovation, which is something that we will also explore as we go along. So the way I thought we'd approach this conversation is that we'd have a conversation around four broad topics, and then open it up to questions. So keep your questions ready as we go along in about 35 minutes' time. So the book, Raghu, is called Breaking the Mold. And I'm going to start by asking you a question. And then after this, I'll just ask you both each question. And, I don't know who wrote which draft of which chapter first, so you can pick it up as you'd like. So the book's called Breaking the Mold. So what's the mold you're trying to break?
Right. First, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being here. The mold, in some sense, is the traditional way of growth, which every East Asian country has followed to great success. And that typically means starting with low-skilled manufacturing, and then moving up the value chain, higher-skilled manufacturing, and eventually becoming more developed. It's what Japan did initially, but Japan was already fairly well developed, but then Taiwan, Korea, and most recently China. And what we're saying is that's not the only way to grow. In fact, what has changed in the world is a whole bunch of things which, one, make that path of growth more difficult, but interestingly open up new ways of growth. So why is it not the only way to grow? Why are the new ways of growth emerging? Well, interestingly, it used to be the only way of growth because the only way you get a large market is outside your country. And the only thing you can sell that large market is manufactured goods. So really the old way of growth was manufacture for exports because that's the only way you can get scale. And with scale comes lower costs. And interestingly, what many emerging markets did was they competed with industrial country labor, offering cheap labor, which overcame many of the other disadvantages that emerging markets had. Lack of infrastructure, lack of skilled labor. They sort of made it up by cheap labor costs. Today, unfortunately, that path is much harder because we're not competing with the American worker. We're competing with the Chinese and the Vietnamese workers who have already, in a sense, reduced labor costs to the level, which is not that much different from Indian labor costs. Also, with the increasing protectionism against goods in the world, nobody is prepared to see another China emerge, even if it be a more democratic India. The constraints, the protectionism against manufactured goods is huge. Flip side, and I don't want to go on too long, is that there are new opportunities, which is, one of the things the pandemic did was verify the fact you could do services at a distance. Increasingly, our consultants sitting in Bangalore can offer consulting services in New York or Chicago, because that was done during the pandemic from Denver to Chicago. If it can be done there, why can't it be done from Bangalore to Chicago? But also, even before that, a lot of services were embedded in manufacturing. Tesla, for example, 40 million lines of code in every Tesla. Tesla is a car, but a lot of the value added comes from the services embedded in it. So what we're saying is there is now a new way of growth which we should examine, which is a services way of growth. Services, definitely, there's the high-quality services that we're talking about. Chip design, for example, which creates fantastic chips for the rest of the world. But at the same time, there's also low-quality services or unskilled services, which has been the main source of growth for India. If you think of the fastest-growing job in many cities is that of security guard. That's an unskilled service. There's been a lot of that.
Security guards and drivers.
And drivers, exactly. So I guess the bottom line we're saying is, by no means are we saying go against manufacturing, but we're saying don't think of manufacturing as the only pathway to growth, because new pathways have opened up, and we need to figure out how to embrace those pathways. We need to go upscale on every pathway we choose, which is why much of the book is how do we upskill our labor force? How do we focus on getting a labor force for the 21st century? Because India's biggest asset is its human capital. How do we take advantage of that? And it doesn't matter whether services or manufacturing, if we get the right human capital, we'll find the path which takes us to strong growth. The point of this book, however, is there are multiple pathways.
Okay. So I'm glad to hear it's not services or manufacturing, it's services and manufacturing. But you do say repeatedly, and as you said again just now, that low-skill manufacturing is no longer as attractive as it was. Now, one could argue that looking at, history, China was not competing with American manufacturing costs at that time. It was competing with Mexican manufacturing costs, or South Korean or Taiwanese or Indonesian or Malaysian manufacturing costs. And today is no different, one could argue, that just as we aren't competing with American manufacturing costs, we're competing now with, let's say, in Indonesia, or we're competing with a Bangladesh or a Vietnam. And I think the example of Bangladesh and Vietnam is that low-skill manufacturing is still attractive. I mean, we see millions of jobs actually being created in Vietnam in low-skill manufacturing. Millions of jobs exist in low-skill manufacturing in the garment industry in Bangladesh, for example. It's the single reason why Bangladesh has a female labor force participation ratio that's so much better than ours. Yeah. It's because of that garment industry that they have. Why isn't that a path that we shouldn't be pursuing in India? I mean, given that it's just across the border from Bangladesh, given that we have an Assam across the border, given that we have an Orissa, a Bihar, a West Bengal right across the border, why isn't it as attractive to us as it is to Bangladesh?
Okay, so three parts to the answer. Yeah. One, it used to be, when you offer the examples of South Korea being there when China was starting, South Korea had become a middle-income country by then. Yeah. So what happens is, as countries grow richer,
so has China today.
They open a path. Not China, because China has its western provinces, which still have abundant labor, which haven't left agriculture. So China is big. That's the difference, because it's still drawing labor from agriculture, and it still has a cheap labor force in parts. Of course, some of it has upskilled, but there's still the low-skilled labor force. Second, we're not saying let's not create jobs in leather, let's not create jobs in textiles. What we're saying is that can't be our only ambition. If we want to grow at 10, 12%, which is what it'll take for us to become rich before we get old, then we better focus on higher value-added jobs also, which we already have a presence in. We're saying don't neglect the fact that we have a huge service export market, and this is not just tech services. It's a lot else, and it's emerging in a very big way. So we're saying don't over-subsidize manufacturing, except especially the lower end. Capturing that lower end makes you king of nothing except that lower end. Capturing the higher end makes you king of the whole supply chain if you can actually start getting all that.
So talk about what you just drew, which was the smile, and you talk about in the book called the smile curve. Yeah.
So, you know, I think what we are trying to say, and we repeatedly say this in the book, actually, is not that India shouldn't aspire to have low-skill manufacturing. It is that that's not. I think there is a certain kind of dogma or dominant thinking in the policy narrative today that is the only way, that you actually go from the bottom to the top. I think what Raghu was trying to explain and what we've written in the book is that India had an unusual pattern of growth for whatever historical reasons, and we can argue it was right or wrong and so on. But where we stand today, where we actually have a comparative advantage in certain high-skilled services, we should actually double down on that and use that to pull up on the low-skill service manufacturing in the low-skill parts of the value chain rather than go up. Rather than exclusively thinking of going up. So one of the examples we give about that in the book is the so-called smile curve. So what is the smile curve? So think of value added on the y-axis and parts of production process on the x-axis. And as an example, think of a smartphone that most of you or all of you sitting here in the audience would have. And let's take the example of Apple, right? Which is now set up a factory in India to manufacture its phone. So a large part of the value added, if you buy an Apple iPhone for 1 lakh rupees, what part is the largest value added is actually it's in the design, the conception, and the modeling of the iPhone, which happens in California. So if you buy an iPhone in the US, for example, it says created in California or designed in California, not made in California, because Apple hasn't manufactured anything since 2005. As you go down, you start making the components of the iPhone, the Bluetooth, the mic, the camera, the chips, and then you start putting all of them together, which is the assembly, which is what the plant now in India is doing, and a major part of it is still manufactured in China. But as you keep going up, so you come up from the value chain down, but as you keep going further, what you hit is what we call in the book allied services. So Apple has iTunes, it has marketing, it has branding, and that again has very high value added. So India, for a variety of reasons that we describe in the book, actually has actually captured a dominant position in both ends of that value chain. For instance, we are designing chips. 20% of all chips are designed in India today. Unfortunately, we don't hold the intellectual property. So NVIDIA and Qualcomm are making chips in India, but it's not an Indian company that is capturing the rents. On the other hand, on the other side of the value chain in allied services, there's something called global capability centers, for instance, that are now worth $45 billion and are employing 1.7 million people. So JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Walmart, their biggest offices outside the US are in India. So on both sides of the value chain, India already has a head start. What we're trying to say is, don't aspire just for the lowest end of the value chain. We understand that is going to generate a lot of jobs, but just think of the ambition. So what Raghu is saying when he says that we need to go a double-digit growth, and I'll end with that, is that think of the aspiration we had. The Prime Minister has set a rightful and a good ambition for the country to be a developed country by 2047. Just do the math, right? We are at $2,500 per capita income. If we grow at 7% and our population grows at 1%, the GDP per capita on average will grow at 6% per year. So we will double our GDP every 12 years. So by 2047, we'll be at $10,000 per capita GDP. China today is at $13,000. Korea is at $35,000. So if your ambition is big, which I think it should be for all Indians, ambition should be to get into a middle income category by 2047, business as usual is simply not enough.
So, I fully take the point, and I think you make the case for the smile curve and the attraction of value and value addition being very, very attractive at the two ends of the smile curve. But as you said just now, Rohit, jobs tend to be concentrated in the middle. At the low value end, absolutely. But in the middle, just to take the same example of iPhones, Foxconn's largest factory in China that only makes iPhones employs 400,000 people at a single site. Samsung, at their largest factory in Vietnam, employs over 100,000 people. The Tata Electronics, that's setting up 3 factories to make iPhones in India, currently are employing just about 40,000 people, rising to 200,000 people in the next couple of years if the orders from Apple flow in. Now, these to me, this creation of decent quality, not wonderful quality, not the kind of design jobs that you're talking about, but if you want hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of jobs, which is what we need to create in India, isn't this indeed the most attractive way of doing so? Because a single company can create hundreds of thousands of jobs. And that surely is a way of actually ensuring our growth rate is as high as it can be, because where we've struggled is in the creation of jobs, where we've struggled is in the creation of good quality jobs, and these are good quality jobs.
Absolutely. No disagreement that if we can attract a lot of manufacturing to India, we should. But not through enormous subsidies, because then we are doing the old license permit Raj, pick the sectors that the government bureaucrats favor, shower them with subsidies, keep high tariffs to keep everybody else out, and that's where we're going to grow.
We fully agree.
So that's your book. I remember reading it and endorsing your book.
Yeah.
But the point, however, I think the more important point is that, yes, that is a way to grow. And, let's welcome Apple with open arms and say, you're looking for China plus one strategies, we're China plus one. We have a big domestic market, and we can be an export market from here. Let's improve infrastructure. The government is doing that. Importantly, let's upskill our labor force. We had a discussion before this where we were talking about how difficult it is to find trained people workers in the electronics industry. Let's train them. Let's do all that is necessary to attract companies to come. But let's not, instead just think that subsidies will do the trick, because they'll do it temporarily. When the subsidies end, they'll say, what's left for me? So that's one. Second is, if you look at the pattern of Indian employment, right, with all the talk about we focusing on manufacturing, look at the share of manufacturing in employment over the last 10 years. Forget the past. It has declined in the last 10 years. Frighteningly, the one area which has increased significantly is, guess, for a developing country at 7% growth rate, it's agriculture. People are going back to agriculture and staying there because there aren't enough jobs outside. So it doesn't matter where the job comes from outside of agriculture. We're for it. Let's get those jobs. Let's get services jobs, manufacturing jobs. But the way to do it is really to focus on the fundamentals. Let's get the fundamentals right. People will come. If you don't get the fundamentals right, you'll hire them for a little while, and then those manufacturers will leave.
I think there's also a misconception about the multiplier effect of high-value jobs. So, recent research suggests that for every one high-skilled job that you create in services or manufacturing, 4 to 5 low-skilled services jobs are created. India is going to see, if we get the growth story right, India is going to see massive amounts of urbanization. That itself is going to generate a lot of jobs. So yes, 400,000 also is it's a big number, but it's actually a very small number in terms of the large number of jobs that we need to create. So we should really be thinking of large multiplier effects.
So, so I think if we agree on the importance of job creation and that you need all kinds of jobs, very often when we look at services jobs, we see the great number of jobs that we see is actually not in IT. The single big sector in services is 70 million people employed in retail. And this is not people working for wonderful employers like the Crossword bookstore. This is delivery boys, someone sweeping out a store, an attendant in a small tea stall, security guards, as you mentioned, the single largest growth occupation, unfortunately, in the National Capital Region, for example. It's jobs that are not particularly attractive, and in a sense, one could argue that they are lower quality jobs. And at least my definition of a high quality job is a job not only where you have reasonable value addition and reasonable wages today, but you have the ability to raise productivity in that job, in that occupation in the long run. And the argument that I'd make is that in manufacturing, we know how to raise the productivity of jobs because we've been doing it for over 200 years. In services, especially informal services, we don't know. How do you raise the productivity of a driver, the productivity of a watchman? I mean, I have no idea. And those are the jobs we've been creating by the millions. So I would only, and then we can move on to education. Right. But I would only, emphasize that actually creating millions of low-skill jobs in manufacturing is a worthy policy objective. Yeah. I agree with you that subsidies are not the way to go.
Yeah. Tariffs and subsidies.
Tariffs and subsidies. I mean, if you look at the production-linked incentive scheme, it tends to be tariffs and subsidies. Now, when people have asked about, what do you think of the production-linked incentive scheme, I've always said, well, like Deng Xiaoping's comment about the French Revolution, it's too early to tell, because I think it's too early to tell. I think we should wait until the PLI scheme runs out. And at the end of the 5 years that it's supposed to run, first of all, does the subsidy go away? And does the tariff protection go away? And if it then survives, and you indeed have some thriving sectors that would not otherwise have existed, I would say it's been successful. Right. If it needs continued subsidies and protection, then it's not been successful. But would you like to comment on that?
I would agree with all that. I just think the temptation to do this everywhere. Yeah. It is. For example, we had a tariff on laptops or constraints on laptop. I mean, you're hamstringing the single most successful Indian export industry, which is the IT exports. Narayan Murthy used to have write about how he had to go to Delhi to get the ministry to release a few computers so that he could do IT services. Do we want to go back to that era? And the problem is, once you give bureaucrats a tool, they want to use it everywhere. So, I think we both agree this is damaging. I would say that even with services, you do see productivity increases, not as strongly as you see. For example, a waiter sort of hangs around, learns how to cook a little bit, and then moves up. But the more important thing, I think, is we should provide opportunities not just for them to upskill, and that's an important factor, but for their kids to upskill. And this is something I want to emphasize, and we can get into education here. In the RBI, we used to have a party every year. We write about this in the book, where we used to call the Class 4 employees. Class 4, for those who are from outside, typically is the lowest rung of employee in any government institution. These employees used to come in. They had a steady salary, not great. They had a house, and they could live in a big city. What is important is they could send their kids to a good school. And because those kids went to a good school, the next generation was all, I'm a manager at Infosys, I'm a manager at State Bank of India. They had transformed themselves from really lower middle class, basically verge of poor, to upper middle class in one generation. In the book, we start with Mustafa, who was a farm laborer's son picking up ginger root. And he failed out of sixth grade. And he goes back home, working on the farm, picking up ginger root with his father. And a teacher comes to the farm and says, "Why are you working here? Have you given up?" And Mustafa says, "No, there's no future there." And he says, No, come back. That is a much better future than growing up being a laborer. He goes back. All the kids in school make fun of him. You failed in sixth grade. He endures that, tops the class in math, tops the school, and then goes out and gets a fantastic job, comes back to one of the IIMs and starts a company, making idli batter. And, grows the company. Now it's it's got 2,500 employees. This is an entrepreneur who started as a farm laborer's son, all through education. I think the transformation powers are huge. But it means that we need to ensure every kid has that chance. That's the crew.
So actually, that takes us to the second topic, which is education and human capital. And my favorite chapter in the book is actually chapter 7, on which you call the childhood challenge, right? And I like that chapter so much because it does focus on that basic investment in human capital that we really need, regardless of one's interest, regardless of whether, if one is interested in high-skill manufacturing, that matters. If one's interested in low-skill manufacturing, that matters. If one's interested in services, that matters. It's one of those universal sort of liberal investments that I think it addresses wide agreement across the political spectrum. Now, if you look at the best assessment of how we do in our school education is what the NGO Pratham puts out every year, the Annual Status of Education Report. And if you look at the 2023 report that was released just last month, the results are, again, quite sobering, right? It says that if you look at, they this time studied somewhat older children, I think that were around 15, and so children who were in sort of the 9th, 10th standard, and they said, how are they doing relative to second standard skills, things they were supposed to have learned in the second standard? And if I remember the numbers, it says that a quarter of all children in the 9th standard could not understand a simple sentence in their native language. A third of all students could not do simple subtraction, which they were supposed to have learned in the second standard. So our education system is failing our children. How do we fix it?
So this is a huge challenge, and we cannot emphasize this enough. Just 3 facts. One you already stated: 35%. So think of human capital as what economists call a production function. A lot of things. You all sitting here. You had a good childhood. You had good food to eat. You had a good education. 3 facts: 35% of our children, as of the 18-19 National Family Health Survey, are malnutrition. Let that sink in. We are talking about Viksit Bharat and being a developed country. 35% of the children who are going to be the labor force in 2047 are stunted. The second statistic is what you're mentioning is the ASA reports is that even though we have cracked the problem of enrollment, which means that almost all our kids are going to school, their learning outcomes are terrible. They're actually very poor, and the pandemic has pushed us back even further, especially in the Hindi heartland. Kids in class 5 cannot read and write at the level of class 2 and so on. Third fact, according to the India Skills report done by the company VBox, 50% of our college graduates are unemployable. So even at the higher education level, we are producing students who have very little skills. So this is a huge challenge, and let Raghu talk more about this, where no matter which growth path you pursue, whether it's manufacturing, it's services, if you're not able to produce a labor force that is able and at least moderately skilled. Remember, one of the reasons why China was very successful in being a manufacturing juggernaut, when Deng Xiaoping decided to open up the economy, they already had a fairly strong, moderately good labor force. And India does not have that.
So, you're both good economists, and economists like to talk of supply and demand curves. I mean, in the first class of the first course in economics. And quality of education is a supply issue, right? The demand issue is the demand for jobs, right? That the demand for that flow of human capital coming out of the system. And one could argue that the 50% unemployment that you mentioned, Rohit, of graduates, is a reflection of low job demand in terms of the jobs that those graduates want. I mean, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo have shown that recent graduates hang around in their 20s, especially young men, hang around in their 20s, waiting for jobs that they're not going to get. Finally, when they turn around 30, they give up and take whatever job they can get. So the jobs are there. It's just not the jobs that these young people want, given their degrees and so on.
Or
and
sometimes
there's a quality issue too.
Yeah. Absolutely. Or sometimes what they qualified for. So what we need to do is certainly, I mean, the first question is why haven't we done better on education? Why is it that our politicians are so much more focused on freebies rather than improving social services, especially the provision of education and healthcare? And I think what we talk about in the book is how we should see this as a holistic thing. It's as much about changing the governance of our country than about just policies that will encourage education. Which are the best states as far as education and healthcare go? Typically states that have decentralized more. Kerala used to historically be, you can say maybe it had something to do with Kerala history. Tamil Nadu used to be very, very good in education and healthcare. Now Delhi is making a big difference, partly because Delhi is actually the size of a large district. And it's essentially a local government. And therefore, they get a lot of value from changing the quality of the schools, the quality of the healthcare, the Mohalla clinics that AAP has put out, because they get credit in the very short term for it. Much harder if you're sitting in Lucknow, in the 5th largest country in the world, Uttar Pradesh, and getting credit for the stuff that you do, because it doesn't reach that village and you really don't get credit for that. So a lot of the book is about how we should change governance, including decentralization. But to your last point, Naushad, we need to train people up for the jobs there are. That last mile needs to be bridged. And there's, good skilling programs are really important. A number of states have good programs. We need to learn from those and do more of that. At the same time, and this is another conversation we had earlier, we should let the private sector flourish in creating that potential last mile. But this is the last point that you said. We also need to get our youth to understand what kinds of jobs they're capable of, and not have this ambition they'll all become IAS officers. One of the most disturbing signs is that since 2008, the number of people sitting for the civil service exams has tripled. It's not that our population has tripled. It's that the ambition, which used to be, let me get a good private sector job, has now become, let me get a good government job because there's nothing else. And I think this is the kind of worry we should have at this point, that we need to change the incentive system for politicians, but we also need to get our youth to accept there are some really good jobs as an aircraft engine mechanic, and there are going to be so many more aircraft. Let me try and tool up to do that, rather than hanker for that job in the IAS.
Just very quickly on that. So there is a document called the National Education Policy, which I recommend all of you sitting here to read very carefully. It's a short document, about 35 to 40 pages long.
It's a good document.
And it has lots of very good ideas. And if we are just able to implement even 1/3 of those ideas, that will make a huge difference.
Very much. I think I'm going to skip the third topic on innovation and creativity, because I think we'll go to the audience in 3 or 4 minutes. And I just wanted to ask one more topic, which is you make the statement that we need an irreverent, diverse, and argumentative society. And I remember, Raghu, when you were RBI governor, using the first word there in terms of irreverence, India was reported to have grown more rapidly than China in a particular quarter. And you pointed out that, that China had actually grown slower, and that's why we had grown faster than China. And then you quoted the Dutch philosopher Erasmus and said, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, which upset a lot of our leaders at the time. Why is irreverence so important to us? I fully agree with you, by the way. I think it is. I mean, I think one of the things that JLF thrives on is irreverence. The great and the good should be listened to only if there's something great, if they say something that's great and good.
So why did we give that example of ambition we start with ambition. We're saying we can be a really great economy if we do all these things. Why is that important? It's important to set the tone. But if you stay there and you don't recognize your weaknesses, which under the current dispensation we sometimes tend to do, we're only great, there's nothing wrong with us, then you don't focus on what's going wrong. 35% malnutrition is not the sign of a first world country, or a country that's going to become first world even in 20 years. So you need to look at the downsides also. I made that comment about one-eyed man. That quarter where I made the comment was our strongest growth, because the next quarter we had demonetization, and since then growth went down steadily until the pandemic hit and we had the worst quarter in our history, 24% in one quarter. So the point I was trying to make is, don't get complacent. Feel proud that you are growing strongly, and that is something we should take in even now. Feel proud that you're growing strongly. India has grown at 6-7% for the last 30 years. That's a great achievement. But if we really want to become developed before we grow old, there's a long way to go. Lots of pitfalls. Let's recognize our weaknesses and start tackling them. The worst way to go forward is to say we have no weaknesses. And that's the way to dusty death.
Thanks. And, you know, if we use our diversity and our argumentativeness as a strength instead of as something to be controlled,
Right.
We can really foster and end up with better ideas, better things that we implement, and carry many more people along with us.
See, every innovator is a radical.
Yeah.
Whether they're a political innovator or an economic innovator or a scientific innovator, you first have to say the old stuff is rubbish. But you have to have the room to say that. You have to have the freedom to say that. As soon as we put ideological tests in our universities, you ensure we get just clones. You have to open up that space.
If you put an ideological test in university, the one flavor you'll get is vanilla. So okay, so let's go to the audience. Yeah. Okay, I think we have a question from Mrs. Turnbull. Yeah.
Yep. Hello, Lucy Turnbull from Australia. One of the primary differences between your economy and other developed world economies, like I guess the first tier, US, UK, Western Europe, Australia, where I come from, is female participation in the workforce. And that hasn't been mentioned at all. How different do you think your economy would look and your society would look if there was a much higher participation by women in the workforce and the economy?
So thank you for that question, and I'm sorry we couldn't take that up in the limited time we had. There's a whole section in the book on this, because obviously this is one of the greatest challenges. So the question was about female labor force participation, which India is doing very, very poorly at. It's the lowest in the G20. It's lower than Saudi Arabia, and so on. So broadly, the way Claudia Golden won the Nobel Prize this year in economics, and one of the theses she had was that female labor force participation as a function of growth rate is U-shaped. So when you start growing, female labor force participation actually drops, because that's the first thing that households do, is pull labor back into the household. This is not unique to India. It's actually happened all over the world. However, India's challenge is that as India is growing more, the U-shaped curve should quicken, that female labor force participation should go up. And I think this is a problem both at the demand and the supply level, in the sense that there's a problem of social norms, there's a problem of safety, and there's also a problem of, which Naushad was mentioning, about not just the quantity but the quality of our growth. How are we growing? Are we growing enough in sectors that historically and across countries have known to produce a lot of jobs for women? A very good example of that is textiles and apparel. India has actually shot itself in the foot through a certain import restrictions that we're happy to go into details later, by adopting certain policies that actually have led to jobs fleeing from India to Bangladesh and Vietnam, and giving up the space that China is vacating to other countries. So, and there are many ideas that China adopted. For example, at the peak of its growth, China had a female labor force participation rate of 75%. And one of the things they did was build hostels for women around offices, which took care of issues like safety. So there are a lot of factors that have gone into this. There is a whole discussion of this in the book, and India cannot, business as usual will not solve female labor force participation.
I'm glad you made an argument in favor of low-skill manufacturing. Anyway, but just also, just to add a comment, by the way, that the OECD estimates that if female labor force participation in India was equal to male labor force participation, which is not huge, but in the high 70s, right? We would be 60% richer as a country. I mean, it's that kind of dramatic impact that we could actually have. So maybe we'll take 3 questions. I'm going to take one question first from the back. There's a sort of brownish sweater hand about 2/3 of the way back. On your right, actually, the lady on your right. So that's fine. Go ahead. We'll take 3 questions together and then, yeah. And if you can indeed keep it as a question, that would be great, yeah. Can we go to someone else quickly while we're waiting for the mic to work? No, we can't hear you. So can we go to someone else? Yeah.
Just give it to someone else.
Yeah.
Anybody.
Just give the mic to, yeah. Yeah, the lady in front, yeah. Go ahead. I think the trick is don't try to switch the mic on, it is on.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Hi. My question was that when you're talking about the smile curve.
Hold the mic as if you were about to sing a song.
We'll repeat the question. Go ahead.
Yes. My question is that, when you're talking about the smile curve and saying that India is already, on both sides of the smile curve, we are right at the top in terms of, but of course, as we spoke about, that, the education system in India, the ecosystem doesn't support that you kind of, you have the workforce for those 2 high ends of the smile curve. So what are your solutions that you suggest, how India should progress in terms of, because, of course, India is a young country and most of the people here are not skilled. We've spoken about,
Okay.
that 50% are not.
Thanks. So your question is how do we progress? Okay. Can we get the mic at the back to work? Yeah? Okay. Thanks.
Welcome to Jaipur.
Thank you.
We can't hear.
Hello.
Yeah.
Question.
Go ahead.
We can hear you.
Hello.
We can hear you.
Hello.
Yeah.
सर से मेरा क्वेश्चन था रघुराम सर से, राजन सर से. In my country, the ancient time, everybody wanted to work in health sector, education sector as charity. But now, health and education system is running like an industry, and industry is running like a charity. तो राजन सर से पूछना चाहता हूँ, as a huge moral values declined. So what do you think about this?
I know what he's asking.
Well, we'll try to figure out the question. I think it was that the health and education sectors are running like an industry, and industry is running like a charity. So, yeah. Okay. And third question, we'll take one in front here. Yeah. The gentleman in the rust-colored shirt. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. So my question is that you mentioned tariffs and subsidies. I've read that the idea is to kind of cover for the disability cost of bringing companies to India. Let's say it takes $210 to make in India, in China is $220, or rather 200, sorry. So how do we cover for that? Because we cannot wait for the infrastructure to develop and then we invite these companies. We need them now. So what's your nuanced response to this?
Okay. So take those 3. So
sure.
Whichever way you'd like to go. Yeah.
So just on I quickly go to the charity point. Actually, we mentioned this in the book that education and health specifically cannot necessarily succeed purely from a profit perspective. So actually, let's take the example specifically of higher education. We have our model wrong because we are producing these purely kind of profit-driven higher educational institutions, whereas world over we have seen that they succeed when they're endowment-driven and somewhat mission-driven. And in fact, we give the example of Christian Medical College in Vellore, which is actually a private medical institution, one of India's most fantastic medical hospitals and research institutions, which is both private, profit motive to some extent, but is actually mission-driven. And that is really the model for higher education and health in India.
So just to add or slightly modify that, I mean, I'm not against private educational institutions, but it's important for us to make sure that the public has good information on their placement record, their teaching record, etc., etc., and then they can make decisions. Our private system works very fast in catering to demand. There is a place for it, but we need to make sure it doesn't. On the issue of subsidies, the problem, I understand the point. It's very tempting to say, how will they come if we don't offer subsidies? Well, they are coming. They are coming because they want protection, they want an alternative source to China, etc. And I think that we can work to make it desirable for them. I was talking to some people in Tamil Nadu. They're talking about Taiwanese companies setting up 20,000 people factories to make artificial leather shoes. And they're coming without necessarily this huge scheme to incentivize them. But you need to negotiate with them. You need to make things much clearer. You need to make things transparent. You need to give them a stable policy. There are lots of ways we can do it without necessarily subsidies. The problem with subsidies is some fellow sitting in the industry ministry picks and chooses. I will pick this industry. I will give them subsidies. I'll put tariffs on all the inputs, et cetera, et cetera. And then the guys who are producing inputs says, how did you put, there's a huge furor now going on in the electronics component industry on where the tariffs should be put. And this is the problem. Once you get the ministry to pick and choose, it leads to bad decisions, if not eventually corruption.
So total agreement on that point. And I'll only add the phrase, since we only have 5 seconds left, comparative advantage, which is what countries should use to decide what to actually be in, right? And that the reason it's safe to mention it now is because otherwise these two great economists would have given us a 1-hour lecture on the theory of comparative advantage. So thank you both very much for your comment.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, panelists, for a wonderful session. We would like to thank Raghuram Rajan, Rohit Lamba, and Naushad Forbes for this.